Good evening, good morning, good afternoon from wherever you are around the world. I hope you're all happy, healthy, and safe. My name is Luke. I am a producer here at How To Academy, and welcome to what I'm sure is going to be an extremely thought-provoking event. Today we are very lucky to be joined by Dr. Anna Machin, Evolutionary Anthropologist at the Department of Experimental Psychology at Oxford University. Alongside academic papers on everything from Pleistocene hand axes to the brain opioid theory of social attachment, Anna has written a book about fatherhood, articles for The Guardian and iNews, and a new book, Why We Love, the New Science Behind Our Closest Relationships, is out now. And that, of course, is why you are all here today, to learn from an expert about the countless ways that human beings love and how that deviously complex emotion shapes our health, happiness, homes, and even what it means to be human. So after a 40-minute or so lecture, Anna will take questions from you, the audience, so please type any you have in the Q&A function wherever it is on your screen, and I'll get to them at the end, I promise. Well, that's more than enough from me, so without further ado, it is my absolute pleasure to welcome Anna. Anna, over to you.
Thank you. Thanks so much. I'm actually just going to share my screen with everybody, so bear with me. Okay, yes, my name's Dr. Anna Machin, and I'm an evolutionary anthropologist, writer, and broadcaster. And I've spent over a decade of my research career trying to answer one simple question, and that is, what is love? So obviously when I started, I thought this was going to be a quick job and I could spend most of my time watching cricket and down the pub. But unfortunately, I'm still plugging away nearly 13, 14 years later. And the reason for that is this, is that love is monumentally complicated. And whilst in the past, maybe as scientists have tried to reduce it to a single cause, maybe love is a psychological mindset, maybe it's a set of neurochemicals, maybe it's a particular physiological process in your body, it's actually not that easy. And as I've gone through my job as an anthropologist trying to answer this question, I found out that love is more complex than we can even possibly imagine. And therefore, what I decided to do a few years back was, instead of looking for that one answer, I was going to go to the other end. So rather than giving a reductionist answer to the question, I was going to go the full hog and go expansionist. And really, as an anthropologist, that's my job. If I am going to describe a behavior or a trait or an observation, I need to be able to describe it at every single level of explanation. And that has really been my goal. So in writing my book and in doing my research, I have tried to come up with many different answers to this question. All of these answers are correct and they all have something to contribute, but they cannot stand alone. Only by combining the answers do you really have a full, or as full as explanation as we possibly can have, of what love is. And that's really where my work is. It's very much a scientific approach to the study of love, but it's also an anthropological study. So in my book and in my work, yes, I do look at all the biological causes of love, but I also look at how our sociology, how our history, how our politics, and how our religion affect our experience of love and who we choose to love. The other thing that I work very hard to do, and is important, and something that I've focused on very much in the book, is the full spectrum of human love. We are incredibly lucky. We get to love so many people and so many beings in many different contexts. And I think in the past, maybe some of the more public facing explanations of love have maybe focused mostly on romantic love, maybe a little bit on parenting, and we've seen a bit of a rise in the looking at friendship. But what I wanted to do was actually look at the full spectrum, partly because it shows how incredible the human brain is. We are able to love our families, our friends, our lovers, our pets, our gods. Maybe in the future we'll be able to love a humanoid robot or an avatar, and we can love celebrities. So we have this incredibly extensive experience of love. And really only by looking at it all can we understand what makes love universal, what makes it highly personal, and how it's unique to each of those different contexts. So tonight, I'm not going to go through every single one of those answers on the screen. Those are the titles to the chapters in the book, but I'm going to pick a few of them to give you maybe an idea of the breadth of love, the complexity of love, what joins us together when we experience a love, but also what is highly personal, what makes it that the way I love and the way you love are going to be different. So that's my plan tonight. I'm going to look at a few aspects. So we're going to look at survival, and that's really the answer to the question why we love at its most basic level. I'm going to look at addiction, and that's going to be looking at the neurochemicals that underpin our experiences of love across that spectrum. I'm going to look at some of the personal aspects that come into our individual experiences of love. So as an anthropologist, whilst I love to look at the universal aspects of a behavior or a trait, it's that individual variation that I think really opens up to us the full experience of that particular behavior or trait. So we're going to look at some of the things that feed into your individual experience of love, and we're going to look at some of those aspects which affect your public experience of love. So what is it about the public facing aspects of love that influence how we feel when we're in love and how we might behave? And then obviously afterwards, we're going to have a question and answer session. So please do think of those questions, put them in the chat. I really hope we can have a good discussion and that we can build on your comments and questions and our own life experiences and hopefully add a little bit to it there. But let's make a start and let's look at one of the first answers to the question, what is love? And that is survival. Like most traits which have been selected for, ultimately the job of that trait is to make sure the individual and in particular the genes survive and carry on going down the generations. So where does love come in that experience of survival? It really begins with the highly cooperative nature of the human species. We are the most cooperative species on this planet, both in terms of the number of different sorts of people we cooperate with, and the context in which we cooperate with people, and the enduring nature of the relationships we build. We began studying love all those years ago, looking at tiny little furry voles to tell us a little bit about the first neurochemistry. And really, their relationships, if we can call them that, last maybe a few months, as they have a very short lifespan. But if you think of how long humans can have relationships for decades, that makes the job of being cooperative particularly tricky to underpin neurochemically. So we are highly cooperative. And if we look at human evolution, there are three main areas in which we really have to cooperate to make sure we survive. And they all have evolved really because of two anatomical quirks. Our incredibly large brain, we are 6 times more encephalized than we should be for a mammal of our body size, and because of our narrow hips due to the fact we're bipedal. And this means that one of the first things we need to cooperate with is to raise our children. Human babies are born incredibly early. That's simply to get our brains through the birth canal. So we cannot be born at full term like other apes are, because the brain would simply be too large and both mother and baby would die. So we have selected birth to occur much earlier than it should be. But this means we get these very dependent newborns. Their brains go through a period of rapid brain growth for the first 2 years after birth. And if you compare them, for example, to a chimp baby is often clambering through the trees pretty soon after it's born, pretty independent, particularly in terms of mobility from its mother. Compare that to a human baby who literally cannot do anything itself. So therefore, during our evolutionary history, we have had to rely on others to help us raise our children. In the first instance, that was our female kin. But about 500,000 years ago, when our brain took another massive leap in size, I'm afraid girl power was no longer good enough. And we then had to call on the next genetically related person to our baby, and that was dad. And that is when human fatherhood evolved. And in fact, we are the only ape who has investing fathers and one of only 5% of mammals. So we have had to cooperate to raise our children. And if you think of children today, yes, they have inputs from their parents or their carers and from their family, but think of all the professionals who also have an input into raising that child. We still cooperate really as a village to raise those children. Secondly, we need to cooperate to subsist in the environment in which we evolved. That was sharing knowledge about water sources. It was about learning those skills of flint knapping, cooperative hunting, and it was about sharing the outcomes of hunts and foraging expeditions. But even today, when you can sit on your sofa and really get everything you need without actually interacting in a physical way with anybody else, you are still cooperating with your fellow humans just to get that delivery to your door. And finally, we have to cooperate to learn. If you think of everything that there has to be learned to get to adulthood in our world, we live in a very complex technological and social world, and we continually innovate and come up with new things that we all have to learn. Then we have to rely upon each other to do that. That's known as social learning. And we are the only species, as far as we know, that actively teaches each other. So it's a really complex and important behavior that we have in our life. So we need to cooperate to do those three fundamental things and to make sure that we survive. But the problem with cooperation is this, is that people lie and they cheat and they steal. And you have to spend a lot of time and energy observing your fellow humans to make sure that you spot people who are going to do you wrong, because you do not want to waste valuable energy on people who are going to be costly to you in the long term. Secondly, we exist in a hierarchy. Like a lot of primates, there are people at the top, people at the bottom, and people in the middle. And again, you have to spend a lot of time monitoring your position in the hierarchy to make sure that nobody's going to try and usurp you, either by pushing you down or by raising you up. And therefore, you have to spend a lot of time building alliances with other people who hopefully will support you within that hierarchy. We have to compete for all those resources with each other, and we have to coordinate our time and days with them. If you live in a group, then unfortunately, sometimes you have to do things for the good of the group, which actually might be costly to you in the long term. You can't simply do exactly what you want every single day. And finally, we have to cooperate between the sexes. And this arguably is the most complicated form of cooperation there is. Cooperation within sexes always evolves before cooperation between sexes, regardless of the species. And the reason for this is because they trade similar currencies. So if we look at the environment in which we evolved, women cooperated with each other to help with childcare, and therefore you're trading like with like. Cooperation is also all about reciprocity, keeping track of those favors that you pay each other to make sure that you're not always giving and the other person is always taking. And this is much easier if you trade the same currency. So women traded childcare, men traded support in alliances to help them keep their position or raise their position in the hierarchy, or to help them find mates. The problem is that when you start having cooperation between the sexes, you still trade those forms of currency, but you're actually trading different forms of currency. So women still want the man to give them childcare, and the man hopes that by sticking around, he can be the next man to have sex with that woman and produce offspring. Those are different currencies, and we have a whole cognitive architecture that evolved to enable us to carry out those complicated transaction sums. So you see, we need to cooperate, but unfortunately, cooperation is not without some pretty heavy costs and stresses. And I'm sure we all have relationships in our lives that aren't always easy. So what did evolution come up with to ensure that we cooperated, we started, and then we stayed in our survival critical relationships? It came up with love. At the end of the day, at the most basic level, love is biological bribery. It is a set of neurochemicals, which we're going to talk about in the middle, which motivate us to start and then reward us for staying in our survival critical relationships. So at the most basic level, the why of love is that it's about survival. Addiction. I'm now going to talk about the set of neurochemicals which make up that biological bribery to make sure we carry out this sometimes tricky role of cooperating with each other. And ultimately, there is a cocktail of neurochemicals that underpin the experience of love. And this set of neurochemicals underpin all experiences of love, regardless of the context in which you love that person. So the same set of neurochemicals underpin your romantic loves, to your parental loves, your familial loves, your friendship loves. They might be released in different intensities depending upon the emotional closeness or the survival critical nature of that relationship, but they underpin all the forms of love that we're going to talk about tonight. So let's start at the beginning with the chemical that most people have heard of, oxytocin. Oxytocin is really critical at the start of a relationship because it acts to lower your inhibitions to forming new relationships. And it does this by quietening the fear center of your brain. That's known as the amygdala. It's a little almond-shaped structure at the center of your brain, and it's where the emotion of fear sits, but also where your risk detection is. And oxytocin shuts down that confidence-sapping voice that you have at the back of your head when you're striding towards a new acquaintance. So it calms you down, fills you with confidence, makes you feel more chilled. But whenever oxytocin is released, dopamine is also released. Dopamine is your general reward chemical. You get a hit of dopamine whenever you do anything you enjoy. So it might be if you enjoy a good glass of red wine, you like hugging your dog, you enjoy going to the opera. These have all released dopamine for you, so you feel rewarded and excited about being there. But as I said, oxytocin and dopamine are always released together in the love context. And the reason for this is twofold. First of all, they work together to increase the plasticity of your brain, particularly in two areas of the brain that are important at the start of relationships. And those are the areas of the brain linked to learning and linked to memory. Because when you meet someone for the first time, you have to start learning everything you possibly can about this new person, starting obviously with what they look like and their name. And secondly, you need to encode this into your working and long-term memory to make sure that you have that information to retrieve when you need to. And oxytocin and dopamine make this a more efficient process to make sure you're good at doing this. Secondly, they're important because oxytocin is a wonderful neurochemical. It's not called the cuddle hormone or the love hormone for no reason. It makes you feel wonderful. It makes you feel chilled. However, if it just was released on its own, it might make you feel so incredibly chilled that you didn't make the effort to, I don't know, get off the bar stool and go across towards the potential new lover or cross the playground to meet a new best friend. Dopamine is the hormone of vigor. It is there to motivate you. It's wired into your motor circuits, and it makes sure that once oxytocin has helped you orientate your intention towards a new person, dopamine is the one that gives you that little kick to make sure that you are motivated to actually go and start a conversation. So that's oxytocin and dopamine, and they are there in that absolute nanosecond when you lock eyes with someone across a room, across a playground, or you first lay eyes upon your new baby, and you get that hit of oxytocin and dopamine, and everything starts to fit into place. The third chemical we're going to look at is serotonin. Now, serotonin is a little bit of a mystery when it comes to love. Unlike the other neurochemicals we're going to talk about, the other three, whilst their levels go up, serotonin goes down when you're first in a relationship. And this gives us a little bit of a clue about what it might be doing. We don't have any definite answers to what serotonin is doing, but we think it might be associated with the obsessive elements of love. Low levels of serotonin are implicated in obsessive compulsive disorder. And we think that maybe that drop in serotonin is linked to the obsessive elements of love. You have to be vaguely obsessed with the person that you are falling in love with to bother to coordinate your day with them, to be interested in how they're feeling, what they have to say. So we think serotonin has a role in that obsessive element. It's the chemical that probably underpins you taking a million photos of your baby's new toes and looking at them constantly, or staring at the face of your new love on your phone incessantly. Finally, we have beta-endorphin, and this is the chemical that the group at Oxford and I have spent a lot of time researching. And we argue that this is the chemical of long-term love, because whilst oxytocin and dopamine are really important at the start of a relationship, oxytocin in particular has two problems when it comes to underpinning long-term human love. The first is it's actually only released in any quantity in activities associated with reproduction and parturition. So reproduction, it's released during orgasm, and it's also released during childbirth and breastfeeding. So it's really associated with the process of having children. And that makes it a little bit tricky for underpinning the vast majority of relationships that you have in your social network. The vast majority of these are platonic, whether they be with your family or with your friends. And oxytocin isn't so good at underpinning those sorts of relationships. Secondly, you grow immune to its effect. It's very short lasting in terms of its effect, and we start to build up a defense against it. It has less and less effect on us the longer the relationship goes on. And therefore, it's not capable of underpinning those incredibly long relationships, which are a marker of human love. So we need another neurochemical which we're not going to grow tolerant to, and which can underpin all those different relationships which are not associated with sex or childbirth. And that is beta-endorphin. It first came to our attention that beta-endorphin underpinned probably long-term human relationships when it was discovered that beta-endorphin is what underpins non-human primate relationships, particularly those which are underpinned by grooming behavior. And the research since then has built in terms of scanning, PET scanning, genetic studies, but also behavioral studies to understand that it is beta-endorphin that underpins long-term human love. And beta-endorphin is wonderful because it's an opiate. It is addictive. It's like morphine or heroin. So when you interact with the person that you are in love with, you get this wonderful euphoric high, you feel calm, you feel warm, you feel content, and you become addicted to the person. When you go away from them, you go into a form of opiate cold turkey, which draws you back to the point at which you receive your endorphin hit. Secondly, beta-endorphin is really great because it's released by lots of behaviors which we all carry out on a daily basis. So, for example, it's underpinned where it's released when you laugh, when you touch, when you do exercise, when you dance, when you sing. Do something like that in synchrony with somebody else, and you get a ramped up release of beta-endorphin, which means it's also capable of underpinning large human groups. So it's the hormone that underpins the bonds that exist between, for example, army units, or between a football crowd or some sports teams. So beta-endorphin is a really critical opiate-based neurochemical, and it is the one which is the most addictive. So that's addiction. What is love? Love is also addiction.